Talks. I'm Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins. Not that many years ago, NASCAR was worth an estimated $5 billion to the regional economy. Auto racing remains important to Charlotte, but NASCAR stock has fallen of late. Since 2005, the sport has lost more than half its television audience, while tracks such as Charlotte Motor Speedway have torn out tens of thousands of seats due to slumping ticket sales. But despite those headwinds, NASCAR races still account for some of the largest sporting events in the Carolinas and beyond. Over the next 2 weeks, Charlotte will take center stage with the All-Star race here on Saturday night and the Coca-Cola 600 on May 26th. Joining me today in studio to discuss what's working and what's not in NASCAR are former driver and current Fox studio analyst Ricky Craven. Good morning.
Good morning.
NASCAR Hall of Fame Executive Director Winston Kelly.
Good morning.
Former Chip Ganassi Racing President Steve Laletta.
Good morning, Eric.
And Charlotte Motor Speedway Executive Vice President Greg Walters. So welcome one and all.
Good morning.
So let's start. I want to start actually with you, Steve, because you have an interesting perspective. You were a team executive for many years, I think 11 years at Ganassi?
Yep, 10 and a half years.
You worked on behalf of corporate sponsors in the sport before that, and now, of course, you see NASCAR from more of a distance as a marketing consultant. So from your vantage point, what happened to NASCAR's momentum, and what are the chances for recovery?
Well, I mean, like any sort of business, there's a million reasons why something's successful and a million reasons why there are challenges. And I think, obviously, the economic challenges that we went through in the early 2000s had an effect when, you know, from a race team perspective, most teams are somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 85% of their total revenue being from corporate sponsorships. And when that kind of area hit a lot of headwinds, that made some things difficult. But I also think that when a sport like NASCAR is consistently, even today, either the number one or number two sport on television with all the choices that there are, and there are way more choices now than when it was growing, right, with social media and with streaming and everything else, that's part of those millions of reasons of what happened and what continues to happen. You know, I think the biggest thing is, and it's not just NASCAR, it's in all the sports. Traditional sports that have been around for a long time find it very difficult to quickly adapt. There's a lot of stakeholders, there's a lot of people that, you know, have affiliations and you want to get input on, and all of a sudden you turn around and 6 months, a year, 2 years have gone by. And I think in today's world, that's really something that needs to be addressed by every business. I'm working with some esports companies now, and they make decisions in 10 minutes, right? Because they're much more focused on getting something 60 to 65% right and putting it out there and having people tell them what to fix and what to do than like if NASCAR, the NFL did that. There's a lot of things that could go haywire in that situation. But it's something to learn from. There's a good mix that I think you have to land on.
And I definitely want to get into some of the leadership and machinations of the sport as we go on. Greg Walter, I mentioned you're an executive at Charlotte Motor Speedway, so you're on the front lines, obviously, trying to sell tickets. You're good at reciting the number for the ticket line.
What is that number?
1-800-455-FANS.
Absolutely. So, you know, the track took out 40,000 seats a few years ago, and you're not alone. That's happened across the industry. But as you look at this and you're trying to get more people to come out to the races, obviously, why do you think it's so much harder to get people to come to NASCAR races than it was 5-10 years ago?
I think it's tough to get people to come to any live event as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago. You know, all the new stadiums that are being built, I've yet to find one that has increased capacity. People are valuing time more than money. And then with the television and digital experiences becoming so exceptional, there's a cost equation, right? Is it easier for me to sit on my couch and watch the great racing? Ratings are actually up this year, like I think I wrote down it's more like 3 to 4% over other sports. Other sports are down like 6%, and NASCAR's up. Is it better to watch it on television, or is it better to go to the track? And that's on us as promoters. Are we creating superior experiences to bring people back? The other thing we're seeing is that people want social aggregation areas. They want a place to go. I want to play some cornhole while we're watching. I signed a PO last week for a Ferris wheel. I have a Ferris wheel that overlooks the track. But people are looking for extraordinary kind of experiences that are compelling enough to say, hey, we're going to pack up the car and we're going to go to the racetrack.
And Ricky Craven, you obviously were racing for many years, so you were in the middle of it, and you've been on TV with ESPN, and now you're with Fox. But you saw the sport from the ultimate vantage point at the peak of its popularity. That is, you were on the track. How do you assess the health of NASCAR at the moment?
Well, I certainly don't think we need a moment of silence. If you think about where we were and where we are.
That's not why I'm having one at the race, by the way.
And
That's right. That's our Coca-Cola 600.
I think it's outstanding. It's a great touch. So I really appreciate the perspectives of my colleagues and gentlemen with us this morning, because they're different than mine. And the way when you're in the sport as a driver, you're very narrow-minded, and it's about competing. It's about what's good for you and your team, and you really don't have a great connection to the business side of it. Having said that, I do understand with sports that when you reach peak, when you've had great success, you're also most vulnerable. And it's oftentimes too late that you recognize, wow, the true assets we had are Dale Jr., Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, and even an extension of that would be Rusty Wallace, Mark Martin, Bill Elliott, the greatest of all, Dale Earnhardt Sr. How do you replace that? And, in big business, you replace it organically or you acquire things. You don't really acquire things in this sport. It has to be organic. And we have a fleet of young talent that's going to pay dividends eventually. But the truth from my perspective is their brands aren't established yet. So that, I would say, would be the most significant.
And Winston Kelly, for people who don't realize this, before you ran the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and even for a time while you were running it these past 9 years, you were reporting from pit row during NASCAR races, so you had a pretty good perspective on what was going on out there. I'm going to maybe phrase the question a little differently to you. If you were put in charge of NASCAR and could change 2 or 3 things, what would you change?
I think I would change the things that are being changed now. I'm not as smart as Jim France and Marcus Smith and people like that are making those changes, Lisa France Kennedy, the things that are being done right now that Steve Phelps and all are involved in. The Roval last year that give credit to our colleague here, changing the schedule up to do something a little bit different. I think the playoff schedule is tremendous. When they first came out with the current point system in 2004, I thought, I was an old school guy. Why are we changing that? Well, I realized at the second Michigan race, when we were talking about 8 guys that might make that top 10, as opposed to the 2 guys who would have been racing for the championship, this is working. And when you look at the current stage system that we've got, that people, the drivers were racing hard before, but they were racing for that one thing, that victory at the end of the race. When there's something that is at interest that there's a payoff. One of the Hendrick guys told me, if you look at it, we were the only sport that didn't keep full score until the end of the game. Mm-hmm. What you did in the first quarter matters. You get 3 touchdowns down in the first quarter, you can't catch up. We weren't paying off, like hockey. We're more like hockey now, that they're points that are paid off. So I think doing the types of things and realizing the attention span of fans is differently and creating those moments, I think we're doing the right things now. And some things are going to be a little bit experimental, like some of the packages. So I think the things that are being worked on now, I think, are the right things, and I think they are paying dividends, and I think the Roval is probably as good a recent example as we have.
And the Roval, just for people who are not following NASCAR closely, Greg Walter, tell us what the Roval is. That was introduced last year.
So in the playoffs, there are every type of racetrack. There are different configurations. There's short track, intermediate tracks, road courses, which is where you make right-hand turns, and there's super speedways like Talladega and Daytona. The only type of track that was not represented was a road course. And the Charlotte Motor Speedway over 60 years has had a legacy of different types of racing. The Camel GT Series raced there, back when they raced chariots, I think, or the earth was cooling. But Marcus had this vision. He was looking out over the infield, and it's like, we need to do something different for the fans, and that natural gap was a road course. So it's basically a combination of an oval, the traditional oval, and then a road course. And we're not bright lights, so we called it the Roval to make it easy. But I didn't realize the magnitude of what that would do and the attention it got. I was in a coffee shop in Nairobi, Kenya last summer, and I had a Charlotte Motor Speedway shirt on, and I had a fellow with a really strong English accent. "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me about are you with that track in America?" And I'm like, "Yes." It's like, want to hear the ticket number?
1-800-455-FANS.
And he said, "Can you tell me about the Roval?" I said, "The Roval?" Of course, I grew up in North Carolina. "Oh, you mean the Roval? Buddy, let me buy you a cup of coffee. I'll be happy to tell you about it." But he was a Formula One fan and had read about the road course of the Roval. And it was a game changer. I'll tell you that last year, the percentage of new fans buying tickets for a race was way up for us, just because it was something different. And it's unique in that you're able to see the entire road course versus traditionally the way road courses are laid out. You can't see all the turns. With us, you can. So it was a game changer, and it's actually up for the Sports Business Journal's Sporting Event of the Year. We're up against the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example of kind of what I talked about earlier, which is taking some chances and reacting quicker, right? So it may have been a terrible thing, but I applauded it because you tried something different, and it turned out great. It was entertaining, and so those are the things that I think would need to or continue to have to happen, and it's happening more and more now under the leadership of NASCAR, and I think it's a great thing to do. Some are going to succeed really well, some are going to be marginal successes, and some are going to be failures, but that's what it takes to move a business forward.
When you think of the climb back to where we might have been, and that was a very, very, very high altitude, curiosity often is at the core of people's intrigue, and there's like, what am I missing? That's what the Roval did, in my opinion. It created a lot of curiosity. Back to a question earlier, I say from where I stand today, 20,000-foot view, I didn't realize how old our fan population was, and it had been that way for quite some time.
Yeah.
Now, encouraging that my son, who's a senior in South Carolina, says, "Dad, can you help me get tickets for the Coke 600? My buddies want to come. I always help get them tickets for the Southern 500.
By the way, if you can't, there's a real problem.
Well, yeah, and I got connections,
That's right.
But
This is Ricky Craven speaking, the former NASCAR driver. That's why I say that. Go
but
ahead,
I
Ricky.
think that's a really important component of this is that kids, my son's age, 22, they don't have any money. So he's like, "Dad, can you help me get tickets?"
Yeah.
But he is interested. I mean, they're really looking forward to it because he's wondering what they're missing. His buddies are wondering what they're missing, and I think speaks. I think that's a credit to Charlotte Motor Speedway and to the tracks and how hard they're working.
And Greg, that is one of the things we're coming up against a break, but just very quickly we'll carry on. But the age of the fans is something that you're watching very closely, right?
It is, and when you look at the studies that NASCAR has done, everyone who's become a fan had someone bring them into it, a Sherpa, if you will. You hear so many stories about my dad took me to the races. My granddad took me to the races, and so that's why we actually, kids are free on Fridays and Saturdays. Kids 13 younger. And then
What about 22?
I have a college ticket for that one.
Let me interrupt you. We're
Go
going to
ahead.
pick this up when we come back on the other side of the break. We have to take a pit stop in classic NASCAR fashion. Stay with us right here. We're talking all things NASCAR on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes this morning from WFAE members and the Charlotte Symphony. Christopher Warren Green leads the orchestra in Ravel's Bolero tomorrow through Sunday at Night Theater in the conclusion of the Symphony's 2019 season. Tickets at charlottesymphony.org. And Queen City Audio, Video, and Appliance offering Whirlpool top-load laundry pairs and French door refrigerators through Memorial Day weekend. Details at queencityonline.com. Tomorrow on Charlotte Talks, it's the local news roundup. State Senator Dan Bishop gets to run for Congress in the 9th District, winning the GOP primary this week. North Carolina's Board of Elections executive director is fired. The Charlotte Catholic Diocese will release the names of clergy who have been credibly accused of sexual abuse of children. And the streetcar is about to close for 18 months. Mike Collins and the Roundtable of Reporters will detail those and other stories tomorrow morning at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Manufacturing is booming in some parts of the country. Take Macomb County, north of Detroit, where President Trump's trade war with China has strong supporters. As for tariffs, some workers say, bring them on.
There is no line for me. I hope they raise it up 9,000%. I don't care.
The View from Michigan, next time on 1A.
That's coming up at 10 following Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and we are talking all things NASCAR. Our panel today is Greg Walter, Executive Vice President with Charlotte Motor Speedway, Steve Laletta, who used to be the president of Chip Ganassi Racing, Ricky Craven, who is a Fox Sports NASCAR studio analyst and former NASCAR racer, and Winston Kelly, who is the Executive Director of the NASCAR Hall of Fame right here in Uptown Charlotte. Greg, I interrupted you. You were talking a little bit about trying to find that younger audience and balance those demands. Continue.
Sure, yeah. So again, back to where we were, and that is everyone who became a fan came because someone brought them. Most people are that way. College tickets, $25. On Sunday, on the main event, you can buy a $50, $60, $70, $100 ticket. But what we're going to do is if your child is 13 or younger, I will let you buy the seat right beside you for $10. Now, that messed up all sorts of revenue models, but we thought it was important looking at a longer horizon to make it possible for you to bring your child to a race. One of the things I've worked in every sport except Major League Baseball, and this sport does something. Sports does something that others don't. First of all, is access. Right, the Panthers aren't going to let you bring a bunch of folks onto the field or into the dugout, but in racing we do. It's the garage and it's pit road. The other thing is the fan affinity for the brands, and we still find that very strong in terms of the way the fans will embrace a brand that's engaged in the sport as long as it's genuine, and it turns the cash register.
Let me switch gears. See, I'm going to use every bad NASCAR pun I can.
Really are.
Yeah, how many more have you got?
I mean, they're endless. But I do want I want Ricky to answer this question because we have a listener's email from James. He says, I'm not a typical fan, but I followed the sport years ago when stock cars really were stock cars. I remember when limited run specialty cars like the Torino Talladega and Dodge Chargers began the shift away from cars based on what fans drove. I'm not interested in watching essentially identical tubular cars with plastic skins run in a circle. The sport hasn't been interesting in years. Now, I'm assuming this is not the first time you've heard a fan complain about those aspects, but just give us a little perspective on where things stand with the car and the quality of the car in your opinion.
So my first impression would be that this gentleman or lady is later in life, my age or later, right?
Okay.
Because I have an affinity for anything in the 60s. I just think those are the most beautiful cars that were ever created. Having said that, every industry has to evolve, and I think we've done a good job at that. I think there were a few bumps. We had a generation of car that was just plain ugly. Mm-hmm. It was the car of tomorrow. And we've recovered from that. And I look back at that and I think, that was the equivalent of Coca-Cola saying, we're creating a new Coke.
That was NASCAR's Edsel.
Yeah.
That was not good.
And the people who drink Coke say, hey, wait a minute, you don't own this. This is our product. And by putting the spoiler back and eradicating the wing, we started that process. We got some exciting things coming our way. And I'd say, I don't know how to answer that specific issue for somebody that has that affinity for the old days, because I don't know of any other industry or sport that succeeds by looking backward. Mm-hmm. I will say this. I think one of the challenges we have, and you're probably all more qualified than me, but I remember as a child growing up, there were so many Chevy, Dodge, Ford fans, and there were so many team fans, Petty Enterprises. And, well, I think that it would be healthier for us if we could create more of a team following as opposed to just a driver-specific following. I feel like that's a little bit vacant.
Yeah, I was going to say, I moved here in the mid-'90s, knew nothing about NASCAR, didn't grow up around it. Of course, that's when the sport was starting to boom. And one of the things that struck me as soon as I moved to Charlotte was every day in the paper there was a flood of letters about I'm a Chevy man, I'm a Ford man, back and forth. It was like another language to me just because I didn't. But it clearly was a huge part of the sport, and I don't know if that needs to come back, but it certainly seems like for a lot of fans that's something that they miss.
Well, and I think what does need to come back, and which would be a tremendous benefit for the whole industry, and hopefully something that with the work that is being done on whatever versions of rules and cars come up, that I've always sat in those meetings when I was at Ganassi and said one thing: whatever we do, Ford, Toyota, and Chevrolet are tremendous partners. There needs to be 3 more of them. Who's next? Like, how do we get Nissan or Kia or Dodge back? But that absolutely has to happen, because I think, when you look at IndyCar, there are 2 manufacturers. Formula E right now has a ton of manufacturers. IMSA, which Ganassi was the Ford team, there were like 17 manufacturers at the Rolex 24. That should be a tremendous focus, and I think everybody, fans included, would see the benefit of more manufacturers.
That's the voice of Steve Laletta, who was the former team president of Chip Ganassi Racing. Let's talk about something, and I know people that are in NASCAR, as you all are, get tired of hearing about TV, but when we talk about sports, broadcast media rights and broadcast media interest are the lifeblood in a lot of ways of measuring popularity. So, Greg, you mentioned ratings have bumped up a little bit this year, but from 2005 to 2018, they fell by more than half, from 8.5 million watching a race to 3.3 million. Obviously not a trend you want. At the same time, companies like Charlotte Motor Speedway or Speedway Motorsports now get about half their revenue from these broadcast TV deals. And when you're losing audience, obviously that is a threat to what the networks will pay you. So for anyone who's interested in this, how do you convince Fox and NBC to keep paying $800 million plus for a product that's losing customers over the long haul?
It's still the number 1 or number 2 sporting event on television for the entire season. So whether you're going up against baseball or college football or anything else, it's 1 or 2, so it delivers that. The other thing is that just overall general television ratings, when you look at the number 1 TV show Friends, 20 years ago, and the ratings and share that had versus the number 1, I guess Big Bang Theory is the number 1 show, or was, the audience is half of that. And so people are also consuming media differently. So there's a second and third screen component, right? There's digital consumption. I do know that digital consumption for us, for NASCAR, is actually up this year. John Skipper, when he was at ESPN, said, I'm not getting credit for the people watching in a bar. I'm not getting credit for that second and third screen. And I think that's just people are consuming differently. All of sports on television, or at least the major ones, is down 9% this year. They aren't going anywhere. I mean, people are drawn to music and they're drawn to sports, live sporting events. And I think, like Mark Twain said, the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. So,
again, we're talking about all things NASCAR because the NASCAR All-Star Race is Saturday at Charlotte Motor Speedway, and then the Coca-Cola 600 is May 26th, and there are a number of other events in town, as well as Winston Kelly, you have the latest class of the NASCAR Hall of Fame to be chosen, which I believe is next Wednesday. Is that correct?
That would be accurate. So, we've got a lot going on and love partnering with Greg and the folks at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, unveiling an exhibit on Richard Childers' 50th anniversary this week, and then it'll be open to everybody in the public next week. But we do vote on the class of 2020 next Wednesday, and we're the only Hall of Fame period that the fans have a vote in it, and they can go to NASCAR.com and NASCARHall.com, and the top 5 vote getters, that counts as one ballot, just like the other 59 people that will be in the room next Wednesday. But we're also the only one that votes and announces on the day of the vote at the location where the induction will take place that the fans can participate. So if you're in Charlotte or have the inclination next Wednesday afternoon at 5 o'clock, you can see who those inductees are going to be. Some of them will be in the audience as well as inductees from previous years. So it goes back to that access that Greg's talking about. The fans have a part in this, but they can also witness it on the day of. So we're very excited about that.
And that's Winston Kelly. I'm trying to say the names and titles over and over because I know we have a lot of voices here. Winston runs the NASCAR Hall of Fame. I started off talking about the economic impact to the region. I should explain to those who don't follow NASCAR closely, about 90% of the teams, give or take, are headquartered in and around Charlotte. That's a number of employees. It's not just drivers. It's people who sell sponsorships. It's people who work on the cars. It's suppliers. So this has always been a large part of the business community. And I want to ask Steve and Ricky in particular, since you have experience on the team side, there have been a number of challenges in terms of sponsorships are harder to get. They don't pay as much, and yet the sport is still incredibly expensive to be competitive at the highest levels. So for each of you, what do you see in terms of that balance? How are teams coping with the financial pressures of the sport in 2019?
So I go back to the evolution of businesses, and you evolve or you die. And in other industries, automotive industries, you have automation, replace people, more efficient. You have the organizations shift for times and demographics and all that. And I look at NASCAR, I say, well, we got a real tug of war between the at the core. You have Roger Penske, Rick Hendrick, Jack Roush. These are pillars of the sport who are very, very competitive people, and they're the equivalent of the NFL team owners, and they're totally all in, invested for life, and they don't want to be controlled in terms of building their team, their product. On the flip side, you say, if there are 40 teams, how many of them are actually contributing? Like the real challenge being that when we went through the Great Recession, a percentage of Fortune 500 companies said, we learned we don't have to do this. And there are other things we can spend our money on, and they just didn't come back. So the budgets have to be adjusted because of that, because I've maintained the bottom quarter of the teams aren't contributing. And I'm very sensitive to that. Not that they shouldn't be there, but they don't have the resources to put up a really, truly great product to compete with those pillars. So if we could somehow create an in-between and model a product like an Amazon where we distribute the parts and they're all the same, and we eliminate the overhead because you're not spending millions of dollars making one piece that becomes obsolete a month later because somebody makes it better. I think that would help the survival of the race teams and make them stronger.
So that's Ricky Craven's perspective. Steve Aletta, you were on the other side in the sense of trying to get those sponsors to give you enough money so that you could keep drivers like Ricky Craven competing.
And that, in all honesty, that's one of the big reasons why my tenure ended a year ago, because it's so difficult. It's just it's a flawed business model from a team perspective. Like I said earlier, if you're 70 to 85% of your revenue coming from corporate sponsorship, that has to be much less than that in today's environment in order to have a team be able to survive and be competitive, not necessarily be at the top or the bottom, but just be competitive. And I think the other leagues have been able to do that in a better way from a revenue sharing perspective and a cost control perspective than any form of motorsport has. And I think that's what's got to be addressed, because if you're really, really good at your job, you're able to, in today's environment, maybe keep your sponsors flat, right? Most of them are going down a little bit because of a lot of the reasons that we've talked about in terms of eyeballs. And so if you're flat to down a little bit and costs are going up significantly, that's just a model of going out of business. And unfortunately, if it doesn't get fixed, I think you're going to see a few more of those happen before you're able to kind of make the model work in a way that the teams are going to be able to survive. I think the teams are doing a great job of adapting, right, and becoming more sophisticated as to what they're offering potential sponsors, from a social media standpoint, a driver standpoint, and an engagement standpoint. But at the end of the day, these are really smart marketers at these companies that they don't overpay for anything, and it's just going in the wrong direction.
That's an amazing perspective to have somebody share 10 years, a decade of that side of the equation. 70% of your top line comes from people who want to advertise on your automobile. that was prevalent for years. And
they're still out there. I mean, everybody would always say, like, we would have tons of conversations going on. It's just we needed X, and they wanted to go as X minus whatever. And so you've run out of inventory for sure at some point, and it just becomes that difficult scenario. So if that 70 to 85% could become 45 to 60% or 50%, you're gonna see a total different approach to how teams can operate. And as Ricky said, if you start controlling costs in a different way, there's definitely a way to do it. It's a lot of work, and it's difficult because you've got teams all over the spectrum. Some want to keep things the way they are, and some are kind of trying to figure it out.
And with NASCAR, and believe me, all of you know a lot more about this than I do, but from my limited vantage point, the thing that's kind of different about NASCAR than the NBA or the NFL or Major League Baseball is these aren't franchises. So these teams are, basically on
their charters.
Right. They're on their own in a lot of ways. I mean, I know they're trying to make it more like the other leagues a little bit, but so the financial pressures are different. There's not really an equitable revenue sharing model like you see in the other sports, correct?
Well, yeah, for sure. You could be the absolute worst owner in any traditional NFL, NBA, or Major League Baseball team. In fact, we saw it with the LA Dodgers, the absolute worst owners you've seen. And they sold their business and made tremendous money, like billions of dollars.
The LA Clippers.
Or the New York Knicks right now, right? So because they have something that there's going to be the ability to sell at a higher number than where they are. If you're a race team and you lose a sponsor, you basically have a building and some cars worth 25 cents on the dollar, nothing, right? So and that can't happen. Like, that shouldn't happen. A guy like Chip Ganassi, Jack Roush, all these people that have put their lives and time and money and everything into these businesses should have something that's valuable. And so, yeah, the charter was a little baby step there, but again, just continue to have a lot of work needed to be done, and work that, in a perfect world would have happened 10 years ago, and we're talking about it now. So it's just got to happen, hopefully, sooner rather than later.
I was going to say, I mean, to that point, how much concern is there that some of these owners are getting up there? The Penske's and the big teams are run by owners who tend to be older rather than younger. Let me put it that way. So, how much concern is there about making sure they continue?
The good news is they're very, very bright people. Joe Gibbs, Chip Ganassi, Richard Childress, and the other owners we mentioned, they have succession plans. And you would assume that there are people that have been associated with them in the travels and in the experiences for years. The question that I think is equally important is, what about where we're headed? And again, going back to 70% of the revenue is about placement on a car, whereas my son really doesn't buy a darn thing because of what's on that race car. But when he's on his phone, he's constantly getting pop-up ads, right? That's not something we competed against 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating for me, because I'm not that bright, to try and understand, how do you distribute that money? Somebody's got to lose it for somebody else to get it.
That's a good place to leave it. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about NASCAR itself and some of the changes with the track companies and the governing bodies. Stay with us. We're talking NASCAR here on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and TRCW, a boutique built and located in Charlotte with clothing for women of discriminating taste. New collections arriving this season, TRCW, located in Phillips Place, and details at trcstyle.com. And the American Council on Germany presenting Wunderbar, Together, a discussion on the social cohesion between Germany and the U.S. It's May 22nd at CPCC Central Campus. Info at acgusa.org. Next hour on 1A, a look at Rust Belt voters and whether Democrats can win them back in 2020. Democrats won many midterm races in areas where Hillary Clinton lost by focusing on education, health care, infrastructure, and the economy. It's that issue, the economy in the region, that could make or break Democrats' chances next year. 1A will continue its stop in Michigan, coming up at 10, following Charlotte Talks here on 90.7 WFAE.
When I was growing up, my sisters went to dog shows. I'm Lulu Garcia Navarro, and they got this really cheap VW. It was bright lime green, and it was called Gertie. They would drive all over Florida where I grew up, and there was always adventures with Gertie because it was always breaking down in the worst possible places. And I have to say, I was never happier. Proof that any car can be turned into the programs you love.
Visit WFAE.org/cars to find out more.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins, and we're talking NASCAR today. We have a panel that includes Greg Walter, who's the Executive Vice President at Charlotte Motor Speedway, Steve Laletta, who is the former president of Chip Ganassi Racing, Ricky Craven, who is a Fox Sports studio analyst on NASCAR races and a former racer, and Winston Kelly, who is the executive director of the NASCAR Hall of Fame. We were talking about some of the financial challenges. I wanted to get into a little bit of NASCAR itself and how it works. Several of you have mentioned the France family. They founded NASCAR back in 1947-48, and the family still controls NASCAR itself. Then the teams, as you mentioned, are charters. There have been a lot of changes here of late. Brian France, who was third generation, he was the chairman of NASCAR. He was charged with the DWI last August and left and never came back. I believe his uncle, Jim France, is now in that role. And then Steve Phelps, who is a longtime NASCAR executive, is the president. So they're kind of the public faces, if you will. So we have that piece, and then you have two big track operators. You have Speedway Motorsports, Greg, where you work, 8 tracks, including Charlotte Motor Speedway. And you have International Speedway Corporation, which is kind of a spinoff of the France family, but is also publicly traded. And in the past year, what we've heard is that NASCAR itself might like to buy International Speedway, taking it private. And then just a couple of weeks ago, there was the news that Speedway Motorsports might go private with the Smith family taking another company, Sonic Automotive, and buying back the outstanding shares. So that's a long lead up to 2020 and 2021. I think the conventional wisdom here is if all those pieces are taken private, then you can really make some big changes to the schedule in 2020 and 2021. So let me start with you, Greg, from an insider's perspective. I know you can't.
Yeah, don't use that word. Good heavens. That's a great way to end up in an orange jumpsuit. Thanks a lot, pal.
I only mean it from an industry insider's perspective.
They're all nice to me earlier, get me all warmed up, open up. And like,
That's a Martha
we
Stewart.
won't, we won't tell anybody except for everyone who's listening.
Right, thanks.
But in terms of the schedule, obviously not the business mechanics, but in terms of the schedule, there's a lot of talk about NASCAR perhaps making some big changes to the schedule. For someone who's on the side of promoting races, what do you think is possible out there? What would be a good solution?
Oh wow! If I knew that, I'd probably buy some lottery numbers tomorrow. I know. Let me go back to something you said about leadership. I will tell you that in all my years in the sport, I've never seen a more collaborative effort between the sanctioning body, the teams. I think we're working differently now than we used to work with. Of course, Steve leaves and messes it all up. But anyway, these guys are a successful agency. Yeah, right. But I think that there is an optic now of that the level of the bay raises all ships, and I think that we realize that our success is intertwined. So working on competition, things like the Roval. We also know that we have to go lockstep. So when the Roval was proposed, we talked to the teams. What is that going to be an expense for them in terms of cars, and how will that impact them? Television, what's that going to do? The sanctioning body, how will all that lay in? So whatever the future holds in 2021, I am incredibly bullish on it because of the way we're moving forward.
Because Steve, on the business side, you have 36 race schedule. I hope I have that number right. 38.
It's 38.
Yeah, 38 race schedule. 11 months. I mean, it is a really long grind, and so there for years have been discussions about whether there are too many races or they're too long. And, of course, you have the financial pressures of the track companies, among others. They need to sell tickets and have fans and all those things. So what do you see from a team perspective? What might make this work a little bit better when you talk about making major changes to the schedule?
Well, again, I think from a team perspective, it all comes down to ultimately the economics and how do you make that work. But I also think from the fan standpoint, with a lot of the things we talked about earlier, the number of choices and everything else, like there's this push-pull of the television networks love NASCAR because they know for 11 months there's constant content every week. But at the same time, you look at things like, the NFL draft and the NBA draft and all of these off-season things that have become major events away from the action. Like, wouldn't it be nice if NASCAR, maybe didn't race for 11 months but raced for 7 or 8 and had an off-season where you could develop some things that engage fans in a different way? You can't really use your personalities as much because they're always racing. Yeah. You can't go take cars and do an exhibition somewhere because they're always racing. So I think if you did some things smartly, but not to take your eye off of the fact that the ultimate goal is to grow this sport and engage fans 12 months a year, but you're doing it differently, there's probably a benefit in that. And then there's the economic value of not having to have as many cars and travel and all the things that go with it. So it's definitely a push-pull. To Greg's point, the right conversations are going on now across the industry, which is the right thing to do. I sent notes to Steve Phelps and Steve O'Donnell after the 2020 schedule was released, because just those changes were such a breath of fresh air. And it goes back to what I said earlier, which is those are the chances you have to take. You got to start doing things. And if both companies were private, and if ISC and NASCAR were, it just becomes one step easier to do it.
Ricky, Winston, I mean, you've both spent your lives in and around this sport. I guess, how open are you to the idea of making some big changes when we talk about NASCAR's schedule and length of season and things like that?
Well, it's critical. It's critical, and there will always be change if you're going to survive and be relevant. But fundamentally, you also have to go back to what made the sport successful, and I think front and center were personalities. And I grew up a Red Sox fan, sat on the porch with my uncles and my grandfather. Carlton Fisk and Richard Petty were my heroes. Carlton Fisk because when he and the Red Sox met up with the Yankees and Thurman Munson, there was always going to be friction, and oftentimes there was a brawl. And it's part of my DNA. I think there are a lot of race fans that relate to that, and that has to exist. But then as part of the expansion and creativity, I think one of the things that we're very, very susceptible to, and it's really, it has hurt us without us giving a lot of conversation to it, is weather. And I could talk to Greg, and it's so critical. But you think about baseball.
You ruined me, brother.
Baseball can play with a mist, right? And football plays through anything, and on and on and on. But we're at a point where we could benefit, at least on the short tracks, from a canopy or something, because you could have these expectations of really looking forward to the weekend and the generational thing of going to Bristol or the Coke 600, and it's a 3-day trip for a lot of people, and then all of a sudden the weather goes south. Somehow we can and should be capable of overcoming that and not be so sensitive to weather.
I want to ask another listener question. Danny emails, can we discuss the elephant in the room? Diversity, inclusion, and barriers to entry. I know that NASCAR has done a lot of outreach and partnerships to HBCUs to drive diversity, but has that actually translated to newer, younger, and more diverse fans? Who wants to take
I would
that
say
one?
yes. Is it where we want to be? No. One of the things we're hosting next Thursday is a diversity breakfast that we're working with NASCAR and one of their partners, and there has been that effort in the Drive for Diversity program for a long time, but they're not as many athletes, and that's what people look at, is how many drivers. But if you look on pit road, where I spend a lot of my time, and the people that I run into, the diversity in this sport is tremendous. Do you see as many diverse drivers as we'd like yet? No. But if you look at in the sport, whether it's the business side of it, the competition side of it, and Steve could speak to this a whole lot more than me, but I know the people that I interact with on pit road are incredibly diverse from a female standpoint, from various ethnicities and African Americans that are down there. So it is happening in a big way.
Well, tying back into what Ricky was saying about the Red Sox and the Yankees, obviously you all know very well that NASCAR had so many rivalries dating back years, but even into the 80s and the 90s. And you had, one of the best of the modern era was probably Jeff Gordon as this young hotshot driver, and you have Dale Earnhardt, the senior, the crusty, sort of rugged man in black. And it went on from there. You had all kinds of rivalries. So what do you think it's going to take to kind of build that back up? Because that's so important to any sport.
It's going to take Chase Elliott, Kyle Larson, Ryan Blaney, and it's going to take them wanting to win more than anything else in life. And I sense that. I think back to, and this I think ties into your previous question as well, is that, barriers to entry in anything. And I grew up in Maine wanting to be a NASCAR driver. That's a long shot.
That's so true.
But I wanted it bad. And at the very base, I didn't know any better. And sitting in the grandstands in Bangor, Maine, watching my dad compete at 4, 5, 6, I have those memories vivid in my mind. And it's consumed my life. So regardless of your ethnicity or where you're from or how little money you have, it really starts right there at the base. How badly do you want to be part of that? And then I think it carries all the way up through to when you get to the top level, are you still that hungry? Now, we will all agree for certain that Kyle Busch is among the most competitive human beings on the planet. He's not the most politically correct, and he's sometimes a little salty or uncomfortable. And we don't need 40 of him, but we need him. I think he represents what we need.
And I would suggest we do have more rivalries than people might give credit. And I don't want to get into people's into people's business too much. But if you don't think Joey Logano and Martin Truex Jr. still don't want to beat each other as bad as anybody, when you look at what happened at Martinsville in 2017, if you don't think Chase Elliott wants to beat Denny Hamlin more than anybody, you have those rivalries. Are they at David Pearson and Richard Petty and Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt? Not yet, but I think there are those rivalries. And having so many people that are competitive, one of the reasons it was David versus Richard is they were the guys, period. Now you've got so many more competitive people. But there are rivalries, and you could go into deeper ones. And these guys don't forget.
No.
How important do you think someone like Bubba Wallace is? He's an African-American driver. He's had some success. He's now at the top level. If he breaks out, what could that do for the sport?
I think it could be huge for the sport that he could grow a new fan base and bring, while we do have a lot of African Americans involved in racing and you see more and more in the grandstands, it is that driver is somewhat like the quarterback that does make that difference. And I think same thing on the female standpoint, that a Haley Deegan, who is one that is being talked a whole lot about, and I think Bubba has that success. He's proven that he can drive. He won 4 truck races in 1 year. And won one not just with the Kyle Busch Motorsports the next year. So he's got the ability, but it's putting that whole package together. And Richard Petty Motorsports, and Richard is one of my heroes personally and professionally, that they're not where the rest of the teams are. So I think that can be a big help. But Bubba's presence and his personality is already huge for the sport, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Ricky Craven, I'm gonna let you do some of Greg Walter's work for him. And that is,
I've been wanting to work with Greg forever.
that is this. I think you probably have an audience. Our audience probably has people who are NASCAR fans, but a number of people who don't know that much about NASCAR. So make the sales pitch for someone who doesn't know NASCAR, doesn't really understand the storylines. Why would they go to either the All-Star race or the Coca-Cola 600 in the next 2 weeks, and what would be the best way to kind of consume that and get the most out of it?
I think the primary reason that you would take the time and spend the money to go to one of those 2 marquee events is that you're going to witness LeBron James, you're going to witness a Derek Jeter type, you're going to witness a great talent do something that you believe you can do, that you've always wanted to do, but you probably can't. And the Charlotte Coke 600 was the race I wanted to win more than any other, more than Daytona or Indy. I think it's the greatest measure of athleticism for a driver, the mechanic component of it, the team part of it, and the strategy. And then the All-Star race is our All-Star race. You know, it's the best of the best, and for $1 million. And if you've never been to a NASCAR race, you need to attend one of these two. I hadn't ever gone to a drag race until I retired from driving at 40. And I stood down on the, what do they call it, snake pit or whatever, down the middle. And when they took off, 3 seconds from start to finish, it blew my chest down. I was like, wow, this is fascinating. If you go to a NASCAR race in the next 2 weeks and you've never been to one, I promise you're going to have that wow.
It's a visceral experience. No question.
What do you think? Could he work for you?
Absolutely. I'm drafting a contract right now.
In terms of, you mentioned the Ferris wheel, any other new bells and whistles out there as you get into racing?
There's plenty. Ernest Hemingway said that there are only really 3 real sports. There's automobile racing, bullfighting, and mountain climbing. For the Coke 600, I'm going to have 2 of the 3. So I'm going to have bullfighting out there as well. So I got to find a really large mountain to put in the out back. But there's plenty to do, all sorts of exhibitions. It's all on the website. And prices for tickets right now for the Coke 600 are 2 for $60. So it's a great deal.
I'm shocked that hosting a talk radio show wasn't in there with Hemingway's list. But we'll keep
Sorry. I got Hemingway and Twain in 1 hour. So that's the best I can do.
Hemingway enjoyed a cocktail or two. Do you sell those?
I do, absolutely. Yeah, I got 1 or 2 out there. Exactly.
I have to cut you all off. Thank you so much, Greg Walter, Steve Lalletta, Ricky Craven, Winston Kelly. This has been Charlotte Talks on WFAE.